Juan Castillo and the impact that he could have on Michigan's offensive line. Chris, you put a story up on the Wolverine.com a couple of days ago with John Jansen's take on what he's seen and going back, some stories of playing against Juan Castillo's offensive lines when he was with the Eagles and John Jansen was with the Washington Redskins. You can say that because they were the Redskins at that point. But he also joined John Jansen on the In the Trenches podcast this week and just talked about a lot of the different offensive linemen in the room, what his role could be, what his coaching philosophy is, and it kind of gets you fired up. He's a old school coach, 65 years old with decades and decades of experience. But my main takeaway from the part of him just talking about what he's trying to get some of these guys to work on and how he's helping Grant Newsome is that he is going to have the role that we expected him to have, and it's pretty big. Talking about working together with Grant Newsome. Grant can bounce things off of him, and he said he's bouncing things off of Grant and the other coaches too, because he says once you stop trying to be the best you can, you don't get any better. He said the work never stops trying to improve. So, this is a guy who was at UCLA last year as their offensive line coach, decades in the NFL as well, and can bring that type of experience to a room that is coached by somebody, while very talented and has a bright future, has about as little experience coaching offensive line as you can have. So I think that's a huge help.
Yeah, and what Jansen said was, he said, if I knew where he was going to be and he was a free agent, he said I would have gone there based on what he had heard about him. That was extremely high praise. And John Jansen doesn't BS. When you talk to him on off the record, he said this was an absolutely huge hire for this program. This guy knows what he's doing. It was clear they needed some help last year. I thought the same thing with the wide receivers, right? Which is why you bring Soup Campbell back. And, no offense to Ron Bellamy, but these are veterans who have been around a long time and have been proven to be some of the best at what they do. So Soup Campbell's receivers rooms here were unbelievable. Those guys got better, and it's the same thing with Juan Castillo wherever he's been. So Giovanni El-Hadi, Michigan's guard, said, man, no offense to anybody either, but I wish he'd been here since day one for me. The things that I can bounce off him, the way that he's helped me. So I think this is going to be great for the offensive line room. I think it's much needed. This is the group that I think we all have the biggest question marks about, right? When it comes to the offense, I know the receivers, they have some work to do as well, but the offensive line, if the offense goes as the offensive line goes. So I love having him here. Excited to hopefully we get to talk to him one-on-one a little bit. It's not very often that we get that with analysts, but I sure would like to sit down with him and feel out what makes him tick,
Just, I was an NFL guy long before I was really a hardcore college sports fan, or obviously in this field. And Juan Castillo's name was a guy that was he is one of the most well-respected guys in the profession, certainly in the NFL level. You almost feel like Michigan is like, what's the right way to put it? Not punching above its weight class here, but to have that guy here as an analyst is incredible. I mean, he's got a track record. Now, does that mean he's the shadow offensive line coach? No, he's here to be an asset, to be a guy who can bring Grant Newsome along and teach him the finer points and just be another voice in that room. And last year, I think they needed another veteran voice in that room because Sharon Moore, obviously he's always going to have his fingerprints on the offensive line and what they do in the trenches. But when you're the head coach, you've got a lot more responsibility. So to have a guy here who can not only serve as a mentor to Newsome, but to some of the older guys, the Greg Crippins, the Gio El-Hadis of the world, a guy who's respected, has gravitas, has a track record of developing talent. That's incredibly, incredibly valuable. So that they were able to find a way to get him here is, again, just another really solid. I wouldn't even say a solid move. That's a home run by Sharon Moore to have that guy working for you as an analyst. So glad to have him here.
And Juan was here in 2019 as an analyst, and that was a pretty good offensive line. Ed Warner was the offensive line coach. The rules were different. Analysts couldn't coach on the field, but they could still be involved behind the scenes, help the position coach, meet with the players, things like that, add their own insight. And he has a heck of a lot of it. So, that was a good line. That was, Runyon, Caesar, all those guys. And you hope they can get at least back to that level this season and then some in the coming years, as you mentioned earlier in the pod, Chris. Like there's a lot of young talent on this offensive line, so if they can get to a much better place than they were last season this year to help out Bryce Underwood and the rest of the team and make sure they can keep that offense on the field more this season, then I think you would set a nice foundation for yourself for the future, knowing that you're going to inject a little bit more talent into the lineup there. Also, Castillo mentioned like just his philosophy on the center position. It was really interesting, saying usually it's the least athletic guy there. Usually it's a really smart player. And he said, like, no offense to any centers out there, but they're a little more cerebral. They're kind of nasty, but maybe don't have all the talent. He said, I like to get a guy like a tackle or a guard over there eventually. And then Chris, you wrote earlier in your article about how, in your opinion, Brady Norton could end up being a center down the line for Michigan. He's probably needed now more at other positions, but once they get more depth, some of those guys up to speed, that could be interesting. And Juan mentioned how it wasn't like that with Caesar. He was the more athletic type rather than the, I don't know, not to throw Drake Nugent under the bus, but like he's what comes to mind when I think of what he was describing with most centers.
Did Castillo mention Norton?
He did not.
It's interesting because some of the coaches that I talked to for the football preview, and you'll read it, actually did and said that's a guy that I could see ending up over there. So it'll be interesting, but because that's one position that if you look across the board, I see guards, I see future tackles, I see a lot of young guys that are going to be really good football players here if they're coached right. Who's the center? And, do you go to the portal? The two of them, the guys that, Oluwatimi and Nugent, who we talked about, were portal guys that came over and were the last piece, the missing piece to that elite line. So I could see them doing that again. Greg Crippen lost his job last year at the beginning of last year. So there are still question marks this year, but we have heard great things about him and the work that he's putting into it this offseason to improve. So I have faith that he's going to be solid there. So, but this is the big question mark again. I was really disappointed that they didn't go out and get a couple more pieces on the line. I know they were expensive, but if you're this close, guys, if you're this close, you know what? Go out and you might as well finish it, right? If you're this close to finishing the puzzle. So we'll see how they do. And they said that they didn't think that there were guys out there that were better than some of the guys they have now. We'll see if that's true of an Evan Link, especially if he's playing tackle. I think you guys both believe he might start the season out at left tackle. I think it's a possibility. I think, as Jansen told me, he said, I think eventually Babalola is your best bet, even this year at left tackle, and then you move Link to guard where he can compete with Nathan Afobe. So, but there's some talent here. It'll be very interesting to see how it comes together. This is a big year for Grant Newsome. I'm not going to withhold, and I'm not going to hold back and say, hey, everything was great last year. It was bad as late as the Oregon game when it shouldn't have been. And you could tell that Sharon Moore was a little bit frustrated by that. So big year for those guys up front and lots of big talk. Let's see how they do this fall.
Yeah, and when Sharon Moore did a press conference, I think on signing day, one of the things we asked him was, what is your biggest emphasis going into next year? And he said, we want to be more physical. And I think that was a direct kind of call out to the offensive line. So to get those guys play a little more cohesively, a little faster, a little more physical, that's going to be the key. And for a guy like Grant Newsome, the fact that you were able to throw some pretty good NIL together late in the cycle and land a Babalola, land a Ty Haywood, those are some moldable pieces where I think it's very important for offensive linemen to get good coaching right out of the box, because that's going to set you up for a push next year or in the future. And, so it's a big year for all of those guys. It's a big year for the guys that are likely going to start and fill this thing out. And it's a big year for that next generation as well.